The 1956 Hungarian Revolution and Fight for Freedom. According to the New York Times, in October 2006, Charles Legindi and his wife went sightseeing, showing Manhattan to their foreign friends. They were walking towards Times Square when an unusual billboard caught their eye on the corner of 50th Street. It displayed an old black and white picture, enlarged to a huge size, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution. It showed a tank surrounded by people from a distance, and the caption, "1956 Hungary. Our revolution was not a movie." Mrs. Legindi noticed an elegant young man in the foreground of the picture. Her breath caught in her throat. "Charlie," she cried, grabbing her husband's arm. "That's you." Charles Legindi took part in the revolution at the age of 20. He didn't take up arms, but he was among the demonstrators. After the Soviet army drowned the uprising in blood, he fled and became one of the tens of thousands of people for whom the United States offered asylum and a new homeland. A graduate of Princeton University, he became an engineer and scientist. At the time of this story, in 2006, he was also conducting neuroscience research at Columbia University. At the age of 69, on the corner of Broadway and 50th Street in New York, he found himself deeply moved as he recalled the exhilarating atmosphere of freedom in Budapest 50 years before. October the 23rd, 1956. There is no other event in Hungarian history that has caused such a stir on the stage of world history. For a few weeks, the whole world focused on and stood up for Hungary. Thousands of people demonstrated in support of Hungarians in major European cities. The Pope issued an encyclical calling for prayer in support of the freedom fight, and Time magazine named the Hungarian freedom fighters its Man of the Year. John F. Kennedy commemorated the event a year later, saying that October the 23rd, 1956, was the day that shook the world, a day that will forever live in the annals of free men and free nations, a day of courage and of conscience and of triumph. No other day has shown more clearly the eternal unquenchability of man's desire to be free, whatever the odds against success, whatever the sacrifice required of him. Why this special attention? Why did the American president consider the Hungarian Revolution an unprecedented event in world history? What happened in Hungary? The background. Hungary, just like the other countries of Eastern and East Central Europe after the end of the Second World War, was under Soviet military occupation from 1945. The invaders forced their own social and political system on Hungary, a Bolshevik type of dictatorship. The Hungarian political leaders were appointed in Moscow, and the direction of Hungarian politics was decided in Moscow. All power in Hungary was concentrated in the hands of the Communist Hungarian Workers' Party, MDP, and its leader, Mátyás Rákosi. Private property was confiscated from millions of people. Political parties and civil organizations were banned. Religion and the churches were persecuted. People's private lives were intruded upon. Human rights were disregarded. And anyone whose views differed from those of the Communist Party was punished with terror, imprisonment, and in cases with execution. The declining standard of living in the early 1950s and the necessity of lying about everything made matters worse. The ritual glorification of the Soviet Union, Stalin, and Mátyás Rákosi was mandatory. Rákosi's Hungary was full of lies, fear, and poverty, and there seemed to be no way out. Nevertheless, 1956 was the year when the grip of the dictatorship seemed to lose its powerful hold on the country. In February, at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, General Secretary Khrushchev made a secret speech condemning the atrocities of Stalin, who had been dead for 3 years. The text of the secret speech was quickly circulated, sparking controversy and dissent among Hungarian communists as well. These debates and the criticism of the party leadership became more and more public, without anyone daring to question the nature of the political system. In the summer, in order to ease the tension, the Soviets replaced Rákosi, a staunch follower of Stalin, and placed the second-in-command official, Imre Nagy, at the head of the MDP. The growing political uncertainty was increasingly felt by Hungarian society. In 1955, the Austrian State Treaty was concluded. After 10 years of occupation, the Soviet army was finally leaving Austria. This gave hope to many Hungarians that the same could happen in Hungary. A remarkable event took place on October 16, 1956. The Hungarian Association of College and University Students, MEFES, was established. It was a revolutionary act since the dictatorship would not tolerate any association or organization that was not created by the state. On October 22nd, the MEFES adopted 16 points, listing their demands. The students called for freedom of speech and expression, democratic elections, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. In support of these demands, a demonstration was called for the following day. October 23, 1956. The October 23rd issue of the Communist Party's newspaper, Szabad, Free People, wrote about breaking with the sins of the past and creating a new type of democratic socialism. In a totalitarian dictatorship, mass demonstrations always pose a threat to the existence of the regime. The party and state leaders were aware of this danger. At noon, the Hungarian radio announced that the Minister of Interior had banned the demonstration. But the genie was already out of the bottle. Ignoring the ban, young people were already gathering in several places. After the police chief had indicated to the party leadership that the police were unwilling to use their weapons, Geru and his comrades were forced to lift the ban. The student march began at 3 p.m., and after working hours they were joined by factory workers, officials, and onlookers. By late afternoon, a huge mass demonstration was underway. The marching crowd, which included the 20-year-old Charles Legindi, was cheerful and happy. No wonder they were happy. The words that were impossible to utter yesterday before colleagues and acquaintances, the truth that for a long time could not even be whispered, was now being shouted out into the open street for thousands to hear. We will not stop halfway. Crush Stalinism. Rákosi in the Danube. Imre Nagy in the government. Russians go home. The anxiety based on mutual fear and distrust was suddenly replaced by the euphoric joy of mutual recognition. All at once it turned out that the once fearsome boss, the stern professor, the neighbor, the co-worker, and the well-known actor in propagandistic films were not the enemy. They were not supporters of the most hated regime. After all, they were also marching in the crowd, shouting and feeling the same way. People exhilarated by their freedom and their own courage were forming a single, powerful community. It was getting dark when a crowd of 200,000 people arrived at Kossuth Square in front of the parliament. They wanted to hear Imre Nagy. But who was Imre Nagy? Why did people trust him? Why did they want him to be the Prime Minister? Imre Nagy. Imre Nagy was a devout communist who lived in the Soviet Union as a Soviet citizen for 14 years from 1930. Together with Matyás Rákosi and Imre Nagy, he returned to Hungary in 1944 to establish a Bolshevik dictatorship. He held several ministerial posts during the darkest years of dictatorship under the Rákosi regime. In 1953, following Soviet orders, he succeeded Rákosi as Prime Minister. During his short term in office, he eased the terror of the dictatorship to a certain extent and improved the living conditions of the people. Unlike his predecessors, he did not put pressure on the farmers to join agricultural cooperatives. He owed his relative popularity not only to his policies, but also to his natural Hungarian intonation, which millions could hear over the radio, which was so different from the arrogant speeches of other communist leaders. In the spring of 1955, when Rákosi came back into power, Nagy was expelled from the party for right-wing bias, which only increased his popularity. But there was another reason why, on the evening of October the 23rd, the crowd wanted Imre Nagy as Prime Minister. Apart from the despised communist leaders, people knew few other politicians whose names they could shout. Since the dictatorship forced the politicians who opposed communism into exile, prison, house arrest, and oblivion, their names had not been public for years. On the evening of October the 23rd, Imre Nagy hesitated for hours about whether to appear before the demonstrators. As a communist, his actions had always been guided by the wish to carry out the party's resolutions. Once again, he was waiting for the leadership of MDP to call upon him to save the day. When he finally appeared on the balcony of the parliament at 9 p.m., he was greeted by an enthusiastic crowd, but his first words caused disappointment. "Dear comrades," he began his speech. "We are not comrades," the demonstrators roared. Nagy tried to pacify the crowd. He admitted that the discontent was justified, and he promised that the Communist Party leadership would take the appropriate measures. People should leave everything to the party. The party will take care of matters, and now everyone should go home. That was the main message of his speech. If people had listened to Imre Nagy, there would have been no revolution and no fight for freedom. But the people didn't listen to him and refused to go home. A revolution and armed uprising. On the evening of October the 23rd, part of the crowd headed towards the city park, the site of the regime's demonstrative parades, to tear down the gigantic statue of Stalin on Felvonulási Square, the symbol of dictatorship and Soviet oppression. The monstrous statue did not give way easily. It was only with a flame cutter that it could be severed below the knee and above the boot tops, and finally pulled down to the ground by trucks. The statue was towed to the city center, where a joyous crowd began to dismember it, painting the words WC on its head, not without reason. And for weeks afterwards, a huge pair of boots could be seen on the pedestal of Felvonulási Square, which proclaimed the Hungarians' desire for freedom. The square was dubbed Boot Square, Csizmatér by the people of Budapest. Another part of the crowd marched to the building of the Hungarian radio on Brody Sándor Street to read out the students' demands. As the communist authorities exercised total control over communications and would not permit revolutionary ideas to spread over the radio, they mobilized the armed forces of the secret police, the AVH, to protect the radio. The first shot of the revolution was fired at this site in front of the radio at around 9 o'clock in the evening. The first casualties were from the demonstrators in front of the radio building, but the protesters were not intimidated. They seized weapons from the warehouses of military factories and from the soldiers who had been ordered to the scene and returned to fire. The siege of the radio began after 11 p.m., and by dawn on the 24th, the besiegers had occupied the ruined building. Their success had symbolic significance. as radio broadcasts were already being transmitted from a parliament room that was set up as a temporary studio. By dawn, Rudy Shandor Street and its surroundings were scattered with the bodies of dozens of the dead and wounded. As early as the summer of 1956, Soviet military leaders drew up a plan for deploying Russian military units stationed in Hungary to maintain and protect the socialist social order. Right before Imre Nagy's unsuccessful speech, the toppling of the Stalin statue, and the siege of the radio on October the 23rd, the Soviet 17th Mechanized Guards Division was placed on combat alert at around 8 p.m. 2 hours later, at 10 in the evening, Soviet troops from the country garrisons of Kecskemét, Cegléd, Szolnok, Székesfehérvár, and Sarbogad set off in the direction of Budapest. The units, consisting of tanks, guns, and armored transport vehicles, reached the capital by the morning of the 24th, where they formed a defensive ring around important objects and tried to control the most important routes and transport points. Also on the 24th, General Serov, the head of the KGB, and 2 members of the Soviet Party leadership, Mikoyan and Suslov, arrived in Budapest to assist the Hungarian Communist Party in planning the next political measures. It is not quite clear whether Ernő Gerő turned to Khrushchev to request the intervention of the Soviet troops, or whether it was Khrushchev who suggested it to Gerő. Either way, it did not change the point. The Russians would prevent the Hungarians from overthrowing the regime that had been imposed on them. The fight for freedom. The Lads of Pest. The Russian political and military leadership expected that the reaction would be the same as in 1953 during the Berlin workers' uprising, when they simply fired a few shots and the rebellion was over in 24 hours. But in Budapest, they were bitterly disappointed. Armed resistance was being organized by groups in various parts of the city who were not afraid to fight the Russian tanks. The main groups of freedom fighters were located in the Corvin Passage, Siena Square, Moritz Zsigmond Square, Tűzoltó Street, the Keleti railway station, and Csepel. Most of the freedom fighters were young workers, apprentices, and students. There were perhaps 10,000 of them altogether, but they enjoyed the support of almost the entire population. The brave resistance of the Lads of Pest ensured that the hope of freedom lasted longer than a single day. They fought urban guerrilla warfare using looted weapons. But the most effective weapon against the armored tanks was the Molotov cocktail. All that was necessary were empty bottles, gasoline, kerosene or diesel, and rags. When a column of Soviet tanks moved down the street, a Molotov cocktail was cast. This was all that was necessary to disable the first tank, while the rest were unable to advance any further. The freedom fighters then used the burned-out tanks as barricades. The hope of victory. The communist leaders and the Russians could not cope with the situation. They tried to satisfy the people's demands. On October the 24th, they appointed Imre Nagy as Prime Minister. On October the 25th, they replaced the unpopular Gerő and appointed János Kádár at the head of the MDP, the Hungarian Communist Party. But they also tried to intimidate the people. There were radio reports of bloody riots by fascist and counter-revolutionary gangs, who were steadily being repressed by the Soviet troops whose aim was to restore order. The government under Imre Nagy declared martial law and a curfew, all in vain. Contrary to the radio reports, the number of armed men and their support among the Hungarian people increased rather than declined. The uprising soon spread to the countryside. Protesters occupied the MDP and police headquarters throughout the country. They drove out local communist leaders, removed the Red Star from public buildings, freed political prisoners, destroyed Soviet monuments, and set fire to Stalin's and Lenin's works. In many places, revolutionary and national committees were formed to secure local administration and to take over the work of the communist authorities who had fled. The management of factories was taken over by workers' councils elected by the workers themselves. In many places, the communist government resorted to terror. The bloodiest incident took place on October the 25th in front of the parliament on Kossuth Square, when Soviet tanks fired into an unarmed demonstrating crowd. Historians are still debating the number of victims, with at least 75 reported dead, but there are other sources that report hundreds of casualties. One day later, a similar massacre was caused by a shooting attack outside the border barracks in Mosonmagyaróvár, where soldiers used hand grenades against unarmed demonstrators. In the 2 weeks following October the 23rd, more than 60 towns and villages were hit by volley fire, including Debrecen, Vaj, Esztergom, Miskolc, Győr, Kecskemét, Tisza-Kécske, and Zalaegerszeg. On October the 26th, Imre Nagy included 2 non-communist smallholder politicians in his government. He promised that those who stop fighting would not be subject to martial law. In other words, he did not promise total impunity and to negotiate the withdrawal of Soviet troops once order had been restored. But this was no longer enough. The Soviet troops had suffered heavy losses in Budapest over the past 4 days, and it was clear that their presence was not the solution, but the main problem itself, whereas the demands of the revolution were supported by the whole nation. It became clear that the party or the government could only maintain its leading role if it took the initiative regarding the demands. On October the 28th, Imre Nagy made an attempt to take the lead in a radio speech. With the approval of János Kádár and the Soviet leaders Mikoyan and Suslov, who were in Budapest at the time, he reassessed the events and called the uprising a national democratic movement. 5 days after the breakout of the revolution, he recognized the organizations that had been established. He declared a ceasefire and announced that the Soviet troops would be withdrawn from Budapest. He also declared that the government would begin negotiations to have the troops withdrawn from the whole country. He promised a new armed force which would consist of armed detachments of workers alongside the police and the Hungarian army. He promised to abolish the AVH, the secret police, but only after order had been restored. But these concessions still did not meet the demands of the Hungarians. The national committees and the freedom fighters demanded free elections, a multi-party system, and the withdrawal of the Soviet troops. This was the stance that the commander of the Corvin Square fighters, László Ivan Kovács, took in his negotiations with Imre Nagy. The Prime Minister wished to win the support of the Hungarian people, so he was willing to step back 10 years to the coalition period of 1945 to 1947, just before the communist takeover. He formed a new cabinet, to which he invited representatives of the former coalition parties. This meant the abolition of the one-party system. Imre Nagy's pledge to start negotiations about Hungary's neutrality, which meant leaving the Warsaw Pact, was also met with the approval of many. For a day or two in early November, it seemed that a new beginning was possible. The Soviet troops were withdrawn from the capital. People began clearing away the ruins. The National Guard was established, in which freedom fighters were also welcome, and the workers' councils were willing to put an end to the walkouts. The head of the Hungarian Catholic Church, József Mindszenty, Archbishop of Esztergom, was released after almost 8 years of imprisonment. Contrary to the defamatory reports published later, Mindszenty did not demand the restitution of large ecclesiastical estates. But in his radio speeches, he sketched the picture of a country in which the economy was based on private property that was justly regulated by social interests. The symbols of the revolution. From the very first day of the revolution, there was an effort to remove and destroy the symbols of dictatorship, like the red star that decorated every public building. The most visible symbol of 1956, the flag with a hole in the middle, was also the result of the removal of a communist symbol. One of the student demands included the removal of the communist symbols alien to the people, for instance, the Rákosi emblem, hammer, wheat stalk, red star, and replacing it with the Kossuth coat of arms. According to eyewitnesses, the flags with holes in them first appeared near the statue of General Bem during the demonstrations on October the 23rd, when some protesters cut the Rákosi emblem out of the national flag. The flag with the hole appears in many photographs from 1956, either in the hands of demonstrators, on the walls of houses, on tanks carrying revolutionaries, on cars, or as the shroud of a fallen freedom fighter. The hole itself can also be seen as an emblem of denial. A whole nation rejected communist dictatorship. The other symbol of the revolution, the Kossuth coat of arms, appeared at the same time. It was only by chance that Beethoven's Egmont Overture became the musical symbol of the revolution. After the occupation of the radio building, the studio was moved to the Parliament building, where only a few music records were available. Between newsreels, the same record was played over and over again. In those days, the whole country listened to the radio, the most important source of news, and the melody was played so many times that it didn't just become a catchy tune for the ears, but it made an imprint in the souls of people. The reason for this was not primarily because Egmont himself was a hero of independence, but because Beethoven's forceful music faithfully expressed the dynamism, power, drama, and heroic dignity of the Hungarian fight for freedom. Operation Whirlwind, the Soviet invasion. While Imre Nagy was trying to win the confidence of the people on the streets of Budapest, the Soviet leaders in Moscow were losing faith in him. Khrushchev felt that giving in to the Hungarians would be seen by everyone as a sign of weakness. Therefore, on October the 31st, he decided to find a military solution. 2 days later, on November the 2nd, János Kádár, the head of the Communist Party and government minister, disappeared. The clues led to the Soviet embassy in Budapest, where it later turned out he had been taken by the Russians to Moscow. Kádár was the politician who was singled out for the ignoble task of forming a counter-government and calling for the aid of Soviet troops. Imre Nagy was unaware of all this. All he could see was that, contrary to Ambassador Andropov's denials, Soviet troops were flooding into the country instead of withdrawing. On November the 3rd, negotiations began between the Hungarian and Soviet delegations concerning the details of the troop withdrawal. The first talk was held in the Parliament building. In the evening, the Hungarian delegation, led by Minister of Defense Pál Maléter, went to a Soviet airbase in Tukul near the capital to continue the negotiations. But the Russians planned an ambush, and KGB chief Serov arrested the entire Hungarian delegation. By the time the attack was planned for the next day, the Hungarian military leadership was paralyzed. On November the 4th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Operation Whirlwind was launched. The Soviet army launched a massive offensive aimed at liquidating armed groups, occupying all Hungarian military and vital installations throughout the country, and bringing the Kádár government to power. At 5:20 a.m., Imre Nagy made a short speech on the radio.
Itt Nagy Imre beszél, a Magyar Népköztársaság minisztertanácsának elnöke. Ma hajnalban a szovjet csapatok támadást indítottak fővárosunk ellen, azzal a nyilvánvaló szándékkal, hogy megdöntsék a törvényes magyar demokratikus kormányt. Csapataink harcban állnak. A kormány a helyén van. Ezt közlöm az ország népével és a világ közvéleményével.
The speech did not entirely reflect reality. It was more of a dramatic declaration in which the Prime Minister drew the attention of the world and posterity to the aggression that was taking place. The units of the Hungarian People's Army, with few exceptions, were not engaged in combat. They were ordered by the Ministry of Defense to obey the Soviet troops completely, and therefore, contrary to Imre Nagy's speech made at dawn, there were only a few places where there was any resistance. After the speech, the government was no longer at its post, as Imre Nagy and his fellow communists fled to the Yugoslav embassy. Only István Bibor, the minister from the National Peasant Party, remained in the parliament to receive the Soviet troops. He drafted a manifesto against Russian aggression and calmly walked away between the Russian tanks on November the 6th, only to be arrested later that spring and sentenced to life imprisonment. The next day, on November the 7th, János Kádár arrived at the parliament as head of the Soviet puppet government. He was cautious and arrived in a Russian tank, which the people of Budapest quickly dubbed the Kádár taxi. Imre Nagy's speech inspired the freedom fighters and National Guard groups to further resistance. On November the 4th, the freedom fighters of the Corvin Passage repulsed the first Russian attack. Fighting continued for days in the forests of the Mechek and Bakony mountains and around Nagykovácsi and Csepel. Finally, the strong military forces of the Great Empire triumphed, and by mid-November, the last of the freedom fighters were defeated. But the resistance did not cease. Throughout November and December, the country protested with demonstrations, leaflets, and a general strike was organized by the workers' councils. The workers' councils, led by Sándor Rácz, were determined to stand up for their democratic demands. In consequence, Kádár and his comrades decided to employ terror against them. Sándor Rácz was summoned by Kádár to a meeting in Parliament, but this too was a trap, and the leaders of the workers' councils who came to the meeting were arrested. The protest demonstrations were crushed by the new regime with deadly firing squads and mass murders. Retaliation and terror. General fear in the country was increased by brutal terror. In the days following November the 4th, Soviet troops and pro-Kádár gunmen shot or killed numerous insurgents and freedom fighters. Between December 1956 and 1961, a total of more than 230 people were executed by court verdict for their involvement during the October to November period. The death penalty was mainly imposed on the participants and leaders of the armed resistance, as in the cases of the commander of Sina Square, the legendary Uncle Szabó, the leader of the Tuzoltól Street resistance, István Angyal, or the commander of the Corvin Passage, László Iván Kovács. But the death penalty was the sentence for concealing weapons or for leading revolutionary organizations and national councils, as in the case of the teacher Árpád Brusnai, who saved several communists from the fury of the public in October, but was still executed. Although Kádár promised them impunity, Prime Minister Imre Nagy and Pál Maléter, the Minister of Defense, were both hanged in 1958. More than 20,000 people were sentenced to shorter or longer prison terms, and thousands more were interned without trial. Among those executed and convicted were minors and women. Mária Wittner, 19 years old, spent 200 days on death row and was sentenced to life imprisonment before finally being released in 1970. Peter Mansfeld, who joined the Sina Square freedom fighters in 1956 at the age of 15, was executed a few days after his 18th birthday in 1959. 200,000 Hungarians fleeing from terror left their homeland and their families behind with no hope of return, in the hope of a better, freer life. The future Nobel Prize-winning chemist, György Olah, and one of the greatest footballers of all time, Ferenc Puskás, were among them. How could the Hungarian freedom fighters have ever believed that they could successfully confront one of the most powerful armies in the world? What could the Hungarian freedom fighters of 1956 hope for? The international context. The international political background of the Hungarian Revolution and freedom fight was determined by the Cold War and bipolar world order. On one side there was the communist Soviet Union, and on the other there was the United States, which represented the free world and democracy. Years earlier, President Eisenhower had announced a policy of liberating the captive nations, which offered hope to the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe, including the Hungarians, that they could escape from the Soviet sphere of interest. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 caught the United States and the world by surprise. The American government, however, was aware that it did not have the means to carry out Eisenhower's policy of liberation, and October 1956 made this clear to the whole world. Although US leaders welcomed the Hungarian Revolution, condemned Soviet intervention, and kept the issue on the UN agenda after October the 28th, they did not take any further steps. In a speech on October the 27th, Secretary of State Dulles made the following statement about Poland and Hungary. "We do not look upon these nations as potential military allies." The message, repeated by President Eisenhower 4 days later for emphasis, was well understood by the Soviets. It meant that the United States would not risk upsetting the status quo and a possible nuclear war. It meant that the United States recognized the Soviet Union's need for security and its domination of the Central and Eastern European region. The lack of foreign intervention caused deep and lasting disappointment in many Hungarians. Western public opinion was enthusiastic and supported the Hungarian freedom fight. All around the world, as in the United States, many prominent public figures expressed their solidarity and raised funds to help Hungarians, like Elvis Presley. But it was mostly the Hungarian American communities who took the lead in the relief efforts. After the fall of the revolution, tens of thousands of Hungarian refugees found a new home in the United States, mostly young men like Charles Legényi. The Hungarian Revolution had an impact not only in the West, but also in the countries of the Soviet bloc, despite the tendentious and hostile news reports. In Bucharest and in the Romanian university towns of Timișoara and Cluj-Napoca, university students began to organize themselves. But the Romanian communist authorities stifled their democratic efforts right from the beginning. In Transylvania and throughout Romania, the retaliation far outweighed the significance of the movements. Tens of thousands were arrested in Romania in the next few years. Around 100 were executed, and hundreds died because of the brutal interrogation methods. The reprisals, which affected Hungarians more severely, gave the Romanian communist authorities the opportunity to take measures against the Hungarian population. Hungarian institutions were closed permanently and merged into Romanian institutions. In Bulgaria, the following story was circulating. An old lady gets off the train at the railway station in Sofia with huge suitcases. She is approached by someone. "Is there no man here to help you?" The lady replies, No, all the men are in Hungary. Why is it important? Thousands dead and thousands of lives ruined. Yet today's Hungarians remember their forefathers with pride. What is the legacy of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the fight for freedom? Why is it important today? And what is the significance of a small country's failed struggle for freedom? The revolution had practical and direct benefits for Hungarians. This became apparent during the next regime under Kádár. János Kádár knew what his predecessor Rákosi did not, that there was a limit to what Hungarians could tolerate. And this realization somewhat eased the effects of communism in the following decades. The Hungarian Revolution and the resulting bloodshed put an end to the spread of communist ideas in the West and checked the popularity of the Soviet Union in Western left-wing circles. As President Ronald Reagan emphasized 30 years later, the Hungarian Revolution forever gave the lie to communism's claims to represent the people. 1956 threw light on the true nature of communist rule, and made it clear that the communist system was not based on the will of the people of Central and Eastern Europe, but, on the contrary, it was imposed on them against their will. But beyond its significance in world history, 1956 also had an invaluable moral and civilizational impact. The Hungarian freedom fight demonstrated and validated the values on which our Western civilization is based, especially the idea of freedom. As the Nobel Prize-winning French writer Albert Camus wrote, "Hungary, conquered and in chains, has done more for freedom and justice than any people for 20 years. But for this lesson to get through and convince those in the West who shut their eyes and ears, it was necessary for the people of Hungary to shed so much blood. The Hungarian workers and intellectuals, in spite of their misery, their chains, their exile, have left us a glorious heritage which we must deserve. Freedom which they did not win, but which in one single day they gave back to us."